I remember clearly the last morning of March, 1536, the first time I felt something had shifted in the court's air, not because someone shouted, and not because soldiers' boots slammed against stone, but because of the silence. A structured silence. Conversations already underway would stop the moment I stepped into the records room. Letters that had once been carefully sealed were now burned immediately after being read. People no longer argued, they whispered. And in the Tudor court, when nobles begin to whisper, it means blood has already been decided. My name is Thomas Gray. I belong to no ancient house. I wear no signet ring engraved with arms. I own no thousands of acres. I am a secretary. I read what others write. I record what others want history to remember, and sometimes I see things I am not allowed to understand. Queen Anne Boleyn had once been the court's flame. She walked quickly, spoke quickly, thought quickly. She read the Bible in English, supported the reformers, believed England could separate from Rome without collapsing. She had been the reason the king broke with the Pope. She had been the reason the Act of Supremacy passed, placing Henry VIII above the church. She had been the center of a religious revolution. But revolution was not the only thing she represented. She represented a gamble. Henry had staked his throne on that marriage. He had accepted being called a heretic. He had confronted the empire of Charles V. He had risked war all for a prince. And in 1536, Anne had no prince. I did not need to hear the king say it to understand. I saw it in the way he avoided her eyes. I saw it in the evenings he no longer visited her chambers. I saw it when he spent time at Wolf Hall, where Jane Seymour waited with a softness that did not challenge him. Henry was not a fool. He understood that if he died without a son, England would sink into dispute again, as it had during the Wars of the Roses. He believed God had not given him a prince because his first marriage to Catherine was unlawful. He believed Anne was the solution. And when that solution stopped working, it became the problem, and in politics, the problem must be removed. Thomas Cromwell understood that more clearly than anyone. He was not a noble. He did not believe in bloodlines. He believed in documents. He believed in structure. He was the man who turned Henry's emotions into laws with nationwide force. He drafted the Act of Supremacy. He organized the dissolution of monasteries, converting sacred land into state property. Anne had once been Cromwell's ally, but by 1536, they no longer moved in the same direction. She wanted the wealth of the monasteries used for education and relief of the poor. Cromwell wanted it to strengthen central power. That difference was not theology. It was finance, and finance is politics. In the final weeks of March, I began copying depositions. The same names appeared again and again. Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, George Boleyn. I read the accusations and felt how perfectly constructed they were. Dates were precise. Places were fixed. But when laid side by side, they did not align. There were days Anne was accused of adultery when she was elsewhere, heavily pregnant. Yet, in the records, the mismatch mattered less than repetition. Cromwell did not need truth. He needed a model. If the Queen committed adultery, it was not merely betrayal of marriage. It was treason, because the child might not be the king's, and if the succession was threatened, that threat could be framed as a conspiracy to kill the king. A legal structure was assembled step by step, and once the structure stood tall enough, It no longer depended on evidence. On the 2nd of May, 1536, the Queen was summoned to Greenwich. I was not there, but I was inside the Tower of London when the barge brought her in. I heard the oars before I saw the torchlight. Traitor's Gate opened like the mouth of a stone creature. Water slapped against enclosed walls. The iron portcullis rose, then fell behind her. No crowd, no shouting. The collapse was contained. The Tower of London is not simply a prison. It is a machine. 3 concentric walls. The outer ward where life continues. The inner ward where fate waits for judgment. And the White Tower, the enormous white block, raised in 1078, standing as a statement that power does not need to explain itself. When Anne entered the tower, she did not step into darkness. She stepped into a system. And I, Thomas Gray, stood inside that system. The Tower of London never sleeps, but it never hurries. That was the first thing I learned after being confined in the Beauchamp Tower. People imagine prisons as places of screaming and chains. Here, the most terrifying sound was normalcy. The morning after the Queen passed through Traitor's Gate, blacksmiths still struck their hammers. Smoke still lifted in thin threads from the bakery ovens. Silver coins were still minted in the Royal Mint. Ravens still hopped across the stone yard as if nothing had changed. That continuity is what makes death believable. I stood in my narrow room, 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, and thought of Henry. At Greenwich, he was likely riding, dining, or speaking with Jane Seymour in the low voice he once used with Anne. I did not believe Henry lay awake with guilt. Henry was not the kind of man who killed for pleasure. He killed for logic, and his logic was simple. A king without a male heir is a weak king. A weak king drags the entire realm down with him. But that logic does not arise by itself. It is fed, it is arranged, and Thomas Cromwell tended it like a patient gardener. In the first days of May, before the trial, I heard from the guards that Cromwell met the king repeatedly, not in loud council sessions with a full assembly, just 2 men in a private room. Henry preferred such conversations. He liked the feeling that the decision was his, even if the idea arrived from someone else. Cromwell did not tell Henry, Anne must die. He placed possibilities in front of him. If the Queen was unfaithful, might she also plot the king's death? If she was unfaithful, was Elizabeth legitimate? If Elizabeth was not legitimate, was England safe? Henry could not endure ambiguity, and Cromwell understood that once doubt existed, the rest would run on its own. I began to realize the most terrifying thing was not the sentence. It was how the sentence became inevitable before it was ever spoken. Once a legal structure rises high enough, truth becomes detail. Henry's treason laws had expanded the definition of guilt until a word, a glance, a relationship could be framed as a threat to the crown. Those laws had already forced subjects to accept the king as head of the church. Now they would force a queen to bow before the very structure she had helped create. On May 15, the trial took place in King's Hall. I was not allowed to attend, but in the Tower news travels like wind through cracks in stone. Anne stood before a jury of men who had once dined with her. The presiding officer was her uncle, Thomas Howard. Thomas Audley sat beside him, advising on law. Cromwell did not need the highest seat. He was already present in every line that would be read aloud. Evidence was presented. Dates were repeated. Confessions were read. Mark Smeaton had confessed after interrogations no one described in detail. Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, were accused of adultery with the Queen. George Boleyn was accused of incest. When I heard these charges, I felt no righteous fury. I felt the structure. Each accusation did not stand alone. They formed a net, and the net had been designed so there was no exit. Anne denied it. She was intelligent, sharp, legally aware, but intelligence was no longer enough. When the jury consisted of men dependent on the king's favor, the verdict had been written in advance: death, not merely for adultery, but for treason. 2 days later, her marriage was declared void, as if 4 years of history could be erased with a sentence. On May 17, George Boleyn was beheaded on Tower Hill. At 6 in the morning, I heard the bells of St. Peter ad Vincula. The tower did not celebrate, and it did not mourn. It only recorded. The night of May 18 was the longest night I have ever lived through, not because of noise, but because of waiting. The swordsman from Calais had arrived. Henry chose a sword rather than an axe. They called it mercy, but I understood it was image control. A single stroke, quick, exact, no repetition, no brutal spectacle, no chaos of blood, only finality. On the morning of May 19, mist lay over Tower Green. There was no wild crowd like on Tower Hill. This was execution in a controlled space. Only the selected were allowed to witness. I did not see the blade fall, but I heard the silence afterward. Silence, not because of shock. Silence because of understanding. Unknelt. She said the king was merciful. Years later, I still think about that sentence. It was not sarcasm. It was the last strategy of a mother. Elizabeth still lived, and in the Tudor court, final words could shape how that child would be seen. The sword fell. One stroke. No scream. No pleading. Only a moment when history changed direction without needing sound. But if you think everything ended there, you do not understand Tudor politics. 11 days later, Henry was betrothed to Jane Seymour. The transition was so rapid, it felt almost cold. But it was not random cruelty. It was restoration of order. A kingdom cannot tolerate a vacuum. A queen executed must be replaced quickly before speculation becomes danger. Cromwell continued his work. The dissolution of monasteries accelerated. From 1536 onward, hundreds of houses were closed. Lands were seized. Gold and silver moved into the treasury. New nobles, not old blood, received rewards. Their loyalty to reform was not theological. It was practical. England's Reformation did not resemble Germany or Switzerland. It did not begin with theses nailed to a church door. It began with a marriage, and it was reinforced by an execution. Anne did not die only because she failed to bear a prince. She died because she became a weakness inside the structure Cromwell wanted to harden. She was too independent, too intelligent, too influential. And Henry, who had once been intoxicated by her mind, now required quiet. But power never stops at one person. 4 years later, Cromwell would be arrested over yet another marriage, Anne of Cleves, that did not please Henry. The machine he built would grind him down as well. That taught me a final lesson. A system is not loyal to its architect. It is loyal to its center. 3 months after Anne's death, I was released. No apology, no explanation. Part of my property remained confiscated. I passed through the main gate this time, under sunlight. London still traded. Bread was still baked. Children still ran along the riverbank. The White Tower still stood, and I understood that power does not need to shout. It only needs to last long enough that everyone believes it will always last. Anne lost her head. George lost his head. Later, Cromwell would too. But the act of supremacy remained. The Church of England stayed independent. Elizabeth the child, once judged insufficient, would later ascend the throne and turn England into a maritime power. But in 1536, all we knew was this: a woman had died, and the state had become stronger. I had passed through Traitor's Gate. I had heard the iron gate fall behind me, and I understood that gate was not only for rebels, it was for anyone who became unnecessary. After May 19, the Tower of London grew strangely quiet, not because it lacked activity, but because it had completed its task. The machine does not feel pride. It simply runs. Yet, at Greenwich and Whitehall, another machine continued turning. Henry did not lose sleep from guilt. He lost sleep from the future. Those who knew him understood. Henry could not endure emptiness. He needed continuity, rhythm, confirmation that God stood with him. In the days before and after Anne's trial, Cromwell prepared another chain of documents, not indictments, but orders concerning monastic property. Royal commissioners had traveled across England since 1535, compiling the Valor Ecclesiasticus, a valuation of church wealth. The numbers stunned Henry. Gold, silver, land, rents, taxes, all beyond the crown's direct control. Cromwell understood what many nobles did not. Religious reform could not stop at doctrine. It had to transform ownership. When the king became supreme head of the Church of England, he did not only gain spiritual authority, he gained assets. But to seize them, he needed internal stability. And Anne, with her influence, the Boleyn family network, her personal block of reform allies, represented an alternate center of power, not strong enough to oppose the king directly, but strong enough to complicate the structure. In private meetings I only heard about through others, Cromwell did not say, "She must die." He said, "Your Majesty needs clarity." And Henry, who hated ambiguity more than cruelty, heard exactly what he wanted to hear. After Anne's death, the dissolution of smaller monasteries intensified. Abbots were forced to sign documents surrendering property to the crown. Those who resisted could be charged with treason, the same legal category used against Anne. Treason law was no longer a weapon confined to court. It spread across dioceses. In the north, resistance began to smolder. The Pilgrimage of Grace would ignite later in 1536. The people were not only angry because monasteries were closing, they were furious because the sacred world of their lives was being dismantled. But in London, that anger only strengthened Henry's belief that he needed an iron hand. Cromwell continued drafting. The act against smaller monasteries passed. Hundreds of institutions dissolved. Men and women who had lived under religious vows were forced out from behind stone walls. Gold and silver were transferred into the treasury. Lands were sold or granted to loyal nobles, men who did not owe allegiance to Rome, but to Henry. I began to understand that Anne's death was not simply the removal of a wife, it was a proclamation. No center of power beyond the king would be allowed to exist. Henry married Jane Seymour at the end of May. Jane was not Anne, softer, less argumentative, less ambitious, at least in public, but Jane represented what Anne no longer could: quiet hope. In 1537, Jane gave birth to Edward the Prince Henry had long demanded. And when Edward was born, Henry believed God had endorsed every decision he had made. Catherine removed, Anne executed. Monasteries dissolved, all leading to a son. When Edward cried for the first time, that cry seemed to legitimize the blood already spilled. But Henry did not realize something. Once he placed himself above the church, he changed more than religion. He changed how power worked. He proved that tradition could be rewritten. And once tradition is rewritten once, it can be rewritten again. Cromwell kept strengthening central authority. He built an administrative machine more modern than anything England had known. Records, taxation, ordinances, all tightly documented. The Tudor state began to resemble a system rather than a personal household. Yet that system still depended on one man's mood. In 1540, Cromwell arranged Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves to secure a Protestant alliance. Henry disliked her appearance. A personal disappointment became political crisis. Cromwell's enemies seized the opening. Within months, the architect of reform was arrested. Cromwell was charged with treason. The law he had used against Anne was turned against him. He was beheaded on Tower Hill. I heard the news while outside the tower, and I felt a terrifying completeness. The machine was not loyal to its operator. It was loyal to its center, and the center was Henry. But Henry was not immortal. When he died in 1547, Edward was still a child. England once again faced ambiguity. And then, after Edward and Mary, Elizabeth Anne's daughter took the throne. Elizabeth, the child once declared illegitimate, became the long-reigning queen of her era. She did not return England to Rome. She did not destroy the Reformation completely. She built a compromise, Anglicanism standing in the middle. And whenever I looked at the White Tower in Elizabeth's reign, I thought of the irony. Anne's death, designed to remove a problem, had cleared the path for a new dynasty. The tower still stood. The Kentish stone still dampened when the tide rose. The carvings in the Bosham Tower still remained coats of arms, prayers, dates. I passed through Traitor's Gate once. Anne passed through once. Cromwell did too, in his own way. Henry believed he was controlling history. Cromwell believed he was designing a system. Anne believed she was shaping the future. But in the end, the thing that lasts longest is not love, not law, not ambition. It is stone, and memory carved into stone.